you. So we are now starting Sociology 1. We've been talking in here about the exam, but some of you haven't taken it yet, so you didn't get to be privy to that conversation. But you will find out on Canvas how you did on the exam once you're all done, and Wednesday will be your last day to do that and the paper. All right, well, we are now turning to new topics in Sociology 1, and we're really turning away from sociology as well, we've been looking at sociology as something all of us can and should do, as a kind of imagination, sociological imagination, that every person who lives in a society has the ability and should develop their ability to study their own society and understand things like race and class and gender and how they affect and things like our changing economy. Those are all things we've talked about. But there's also a side of sociology which is professional sociology, which is sociology done by people with letters behind their name, like PhD and MA. And so we're really turning to the research process here now. Most people who do sociology with a small s, regular people every day, we don't go out and do research to decide what we think, sociological research. We may do other kinds of research like Googling things, but doing actual gathering of data and analyzing of data, that's something you probably wouldn't do unless you had a real reason to do it. You were being paid or you were trying to solve some issue that sociological research could help you solve. But it's important for us to understand the research process. How is it that sociologists go about doing their sociological research? When we read, we've talked about sociologists in here, like Bobo and Smith, and the other ones we talked about, like Gloria Ancheta and Roberto Suro. And we talked about their findings and things they discovered about race in America and things ways of analyzing it that they put forward. But how do sociologists do their research? And so we need to talk a little bit about that. And it's to make the question a little more relevant to you, again, if you're not planning to become a sociologist, why care how they do their research? Well, it matters because sociology has a lot, or social science in general, has a lot of impact on policy, like when presidents or politicians are making decisions about what kind of policy should we have? Should we allow this or that? How much taxes should we collect? How low should we get? What should we do with the tax money once we get it? Those kinds of questions oftentimes are guided by social scientific research and deciding, what's a good way to spend our money. For example, just to take one out of the hat, how much money should we put into early childhood education, children 0 to 5? And, if parents aren't putting a lot of money into that or they're not able to, should society be stepping in to make sure children 0 to 5 are being well developed? I mean, it's a good sociological question to ask, because if we have a country with a lot of children that didn't meet their full potential when they were developing, 0 years old to 5 years old, we could end up with adults that aren't at their full potential, and we could end up a weaker country. And so it's a smart idea for leaders in charge to say, well, we got to invest tax money in a smart way. How much should we put to 0 to 5? And that might be a good, research question for social scientists to take up. And so a lot of policy questions are guided by, research. And so one reason for you to know about it is not because you're going to be president one day, but you get to vote on them, for example, and vote on mayors and city councils and all those kinds of things. So being aware of what does research tell us about what's a good choices to make as a society. Most Americans, the choices we make are just our own. Should I get a job or not? What kind of job should I get? Sociology is asking you to think in terms of your collectivity, your whole society, what's good choices for it to make. And when we think those ways, we might need research, not just our own gut or our own feelings about a situation, but what does the research tell us? So that's a reason to pay attention here, is because when it comes to debates in our society about things like taxes and how much to collect or not and how much to put where, these are policy questions that research hopefully could help us decide and make good decisions about. And then also, when you read a study, if you read in the newspaper, sociologists say this is true or X is true. Are you able to read that and go, I think that was a good study? Or are you able to go, oh, that's a crappy study that they just did right there. I'm not going to buy what they just said because that was a poorly done study. So if you can develop your own ability to know how good studies are done and what a good study is and a bad study is, then you can develop your own ability to decide when you're reading the newspaper or hearing on the news that social scientists have determined that X or Y is true. Well, you can begin to do what I had I'm going to cuss here on TV if you don't mind. I had a sociology teacher that said, when you hear a statement like social scientists say this, or this is true out of 3 or 4 people, or any statement about what's true of other people, your little shit detectors should go up. Is that really true what I just heard? How do I know it's true? Just because I read it in the paper? Just because they said it on the news? How do I know it's true? And if you really get to good at studying social science, you could decide yourself, not just wait for some person to tell you whether it was a good study or not, but go look at their study. Anyway, so those are some good reasons to pay attention to the research process, even if you don't expect to engage in it yourself. And I've had to decide things I need to cut from this class. I usually spend quite a bit on the research process, and I take you kind of laboriously through the whole thing. And I kind of realized that might be a little more than students need, and we need to pare down what we're doing here. So I'm trying again something new in teaching it, in that I'm just going to focus on some key points about the research process that I think are key for us to pay attention to. One is just this. A lot of science looks something like this. I mean, once I start putting X's and Y's and lines on the board, we're getting serious here, man. We're not just talking about life. We're starting to do some science here. Well, a lot of science boils down to this. We're trying to figure out what's called causality or causation. Do we know what causes other things to happen or not? And I would say that the main difference between science and other kinds of thinking, because there's lots of ways to decide things. You can decide things by flipping a coin. Should I get married or not? I'm going to flip a coin. You could decide things by tea leaves. Look at my tea after I drink it and decide what it's telling me about my future. I don't recommend those superstitious ways of deciding, but science is really just a way of deciding what's true or not, or what's a good decision or not. And what is science really trying to do? Well, I would say its big difference between other types of thinking is that it's rigorous, meaning it uses logic and evidence to decide things. And so that's going to be sort of the central point I'm making here. But causation, let me give you an example of something a lot of people might think is causal, but maybe isn't. A study was done in the 1970s that showed that pot smoking, and maybe this is a relevant piece of research given the election last week as well, because we legalized marijuana here in California. Well, this research showed back in the 1970s that pot smoking was positively and directly correlated with GPA of college students. So this was a study of college students and their pot smoking habits, and the study showed that students who smoke pot, in other words, its pot smoking went up, then GPA went up. Meaning when you compared students in the college, in this study, they compared students in college and they looked at those who said they did smoke pot and they compared them to those who said they don't smoke pot. And then they looked at their grade point averages and they found that those who did smoke pot, on average, had better grades than those who don't smoke pot. Does that sound right to you? Why not?
Not one of those enhancing things.
Well, it might be, but causation. Do you really believe that if you just go home and start smoking more joints, that your grades are all going to go up? Is there some direct causal connection between getting high and getting good grades? You doubt that there is. In other words, your common sense, it's called, your own intuition, tells you, I don't think that causes that. I don't think college students, just by smoking pot, are going to end up with better grades than people who don't smoke pot. But that's what this study found. This study found that. So, should we all go out? Should I get you a bunch of joints? And that would be the best way to help you guys do better in this class? If you just got your test back. I don't know how much pot you smoke now, but should you start smoking a lot more pot now and then you get better grades on this test later on in the class? You sure? The study found it.
Maybe it's from smoking pot, they just study more because they're just lazy in their room.
So we want to be rigorous. We don't want to just say, well, we saw that the study found this, or we saw some data that showed this, so therefore we're just going to go start smoking pot. What you just did was give us a little more rigor. You said, well, logically, just because this happened and then this happened, that doesn't mean this caused this to happen. Something else could have happened in between. You said, well, maybe there's an intervening variable. This, by the way, is called the independent variable. That's what we're trying to find out. We're trying to find out whether marijuana smoking is dependent on, whether grades are dependent on marijuana smoking in order to get better. But you're saying, I doubt it is. I doubt that you need to smoke pot in order to get grades up. And so you're saying maybe something else happened. This is known as an intervening variable. Maybe something else happened after people smoked pot, and then they went and took their test, and maybe this intervening thing was the real cause of the higher grades. And you just gave us a theory. Holly, what was it again that you said? Maybe they just...
Maybe they're studying more because they're...
Okay, so maybe pot smoking led me to study more. Maybe I was really worried about all the times I was sitting there playing video games eating Cheetos. So I decided I better study hard because I've been spending so much time being high, I better study more. And if I study more, maybe I'll get better grades. And so you're saying it's not that pot smokers, just by smoking pot, they end up doing better than other people. But because they smoke pot, or at least some of them, they decide to work harder to make up for that, and they end up getting better grades. Maybe. Are there other intervening variables you can think of? So part of being a good scientist is using your logic here and asking yourself in your mind, and this shouldn't be hard for you because you're college students. You're spending your time getting grades all the time, aren't you? Don't you talk to other students about, wow, you got an A on that? How'd you do that? Because all I got was a D. So students talk to each other all the time about what are some good strategies for getting better grades, what are bad ideas, and so you should be able to think through here, knowing what you know about college students and what you know about pot smoking college students maybe. What else might be happening other than smoking pot that could lead to higher grades? Okay, so maybe they're just less stressed, and if you're less stressed, then maybe that leads to higher grades. But your theory is it's not the pot smoking per se, although in this case the pot smoking helped because it made them less stressed. But you're saying if they use some other method to have less stress, like what? Like yoga, they meditate, I don't know, they exercise, they listen to soothing music, whatever it is, if they're less stressed, that's the key. It's not the pot smoking, it's being less stressed. And we do say in the theories in any kind of theorizing, if you're saying one thing's causing another, you really mean the most proximate cause, the thing that's closest to the thing. Because if there was a bunch of other steps in between, then this isn't really the cause, it's part of the chain of events, but this would be the cause then. So, any other things you can think of?
Maybe they started out with higher, intelligence. They were just smarter.
Okay, well, where would that go?
Well, if they were smarter, their classes would be easier, their grades would be up, just because...
Well, you're describing something that they brought with them to school. You're describing something that was true about these students before they ever got to college, before they ever smoked any pot, before they ever took any classes. They were just smart.
Yeah.
So you're saying, maybe my Z is over here. Maybe it isn't after the pot smoking that led to the higher grades. Maybe there's something over here. This is called an antecedent variable. It's antecedent, that means coming before. Came before the independent variable. This intervened. This came in between the independent variable and the dependent variable. But we could also be looking what was true before they even got to college, because sometimes there's pre-existing things about people that decides how they, later things that happen to them. And so you're saying maybe they're just smart And if they're smart, maybe that explains why they smoke pot somehow. Maybe smart students are more likely to smoke pot than not such smart students. And maybe smart students are more likely to get good grades than not such smart students. So it's simply the variable of smartness that explains both why they smoke pot and why they got good grades. And they would have gotten the good grades anyway, even if they didn't smoke the pot. Maybe. But before we start talking more about the antecedent variables, are there other things you can think of intervening? And this shouldn't be hard. I like to think of this as a fun little exercise. You're trying to figure out why it was in the 1970s that these researchers found a strong connection between pot smoking and grades. We know it can't be that smoking pot gives you higher grades. So it's a fun little exercise, I think, to try and think through. What else could it be? If it's not fun for you, then you shouldn't be in sociology, because this is what sociologists think is fun. And you still have time to drop the class. And maybe some of you, after your grades, you should. But I think it's fun, so we're going to keep doing with it.
Social interaction.
What about it?
Generally, people who smoke pot are doing it with more than one person at a time, so then that social interaction can inevitably turns into like a study group sort of thing.
Okay, so they don't just party, they party and then they go say, hey, let's meet on Tuesday and we'll study for the sociology exam. So, but really what you're saying is it's study groups. And maybe there is a connection between smoking pot and the social activity of that and being more likely to find people to study with. And maybe that's all we're saying, is that if you're likely to smoke pot, you're also likely to end up finding people to study with. And if you're somebody who stays home all the time by yourself, you're not likely to smoke pot and you're not likely to find somebody to study with. So maybe that's all it is. Are there other intervening or antecedent variables you could imagine? I mean, forget about the pot smoking, because we know that's not what it is. So just try to think it to yourself of other reasons why people do well in college. When you think of the people you know who do well in college and the people you know who are struggling hard to pass their classes, when I look around this room, I see people who did really well on the exam. And I see some people that struggled to pass it. And I don't think any of it, for any of you, pot smoking was either way the issue. So what are the issues?
Maybe pot smokers take easier classes.
Okay, well maybe I'm just taking underwater basket weaving and rocks for jocks and stuff like that. And if you're just taking really easy classes, well, easy classes could certainly lead to higher grades. And maybe there's something true about pot smokers that they don't want to work too hard in college, so they're more likely to take the easy classes and they're more likely to smoke pot and they end up with the better grades. Are there other ways to get good grades?
I was going to say time management. Maybe they're trying to get everything done, but then you get done in the day because they want to themselves. It's like
The little reward, self-reward. Well, you could call it a self-reward system, and maybe these are people who have a good self-control of managing their work and rewarding themselves with a little bit of illegal drugs. At the end of the day, it will no longer illegal. But maybe, but there again, sometimes common sense. I mean, is it your experience that the pot smokers you know are super organized, driven people? I mean, I don't want to stereotype people. There used to be this idea that pot smoking led to this thing called amotivational syndrome, that somehow pot smokers were less motivated and less organized than other people. That's not very well substantiated in the research either, because there's plenty of type A, highly professional, highly successful people that smoke pot. So you may be right about that. Other theories?
People who have substance tendencies tend to be more obsessive, and thus they're better people academically.
Okay, so maybe it's part of a larger syndrome, an OCD thing, obsessive compulsive disorder, that makes them want to smoke pot. Maybe actually you're describing an antecedent variable. People with OCD are more likely to self-medicate with pot, and they're more likely to get better grades than people. I don't know if that's true, that people with OCD are more likely to self-medicate, but that's a theory you're putting forward there. None of you yet have found the theory that the researchers themselves settled on when they did this study, but can you think of any other things? And again, some of you who, it's a chance to use your mind here. Can you think of there's another way that's increasingly common for people to get good grades. It's one I don't like, but it's one you might associate with pot smoking.
They cheat.
They cheat. Maybe they're cheaters. I mean, is it reasonable to think people who are willing to break our national drug laws are also willing to break our academic integrity rules around here? Maybe. So maybe they're just cheating more. And if they're cheating, well, that explains their better grades.
I have a more of a calorie count because they're smoking pot. So they get the munchies. So they're,
You're reaching, you're stretching. But yeah, okay, so Twinkie, yours is the Twinkie theory. There used to be a Twinkie defense. There was a guy who killed somebody. He was like, I ate too many Twinkies, and they're like, okay, you're innocent. No, I don't remember the exact thing, but it was called the Twinkie defense. And you're saying this is the Twinkie theory of good grades, as if you just eat a lot of junk food. No, I'm just kidding. But you're saying they eat more. They have better nutrition. And if you're better nutrition, you're going to do better. Maybe, but I'm joking with you because the kinds of foods that we stereotypically associate with pot smoking are things like Twinkies and a whole thing of Ben & Jerry's. But anyway, but maybe they are better. It is, again, I'm playing in stereotypes because nowadays actually you could make a case that a lot of the pot smokers are people who are very into good health and good eating and other things. And so maybe it is part of a larger thing of wellness and taking care of yourself, possibly. But that also raises the issue of history. In sociology, history matters more than it does in a field like psychology. I mean, the human brain probably hasn't changed that much in thousands of years. So you don't need to think about, well, what decade was that person living in order to study psychology most of the time. But in sociology, things change socially all the time. And so if we're trying to understand people's behavior, we may need to take history into account. When did I say this study was done? 1970s. You guys weren't alive then. But are there reason to think pot smoking was a bit of a different activity back then than it was now? That it meant something different to the people doing it? That it was engaged in by different sorts of people than it is now? Those are things to keep in mind when we think about what might be the connection here.
the potency of the drug at that time was probably different.
The drug, some people say the marijuana today is much more powerful than it was then, that the THC content is higher and things like that. I don't know how true those things are. I mean, they're true scientifically, but whether they alter the person that much in terms of when they're not on the drug, I don't know if there's any sign of that. I mean, certainly when they're on the drug, people may be higher for longer periods than they were back then. But there's no studies I know of that say once they're done smoking, they're much different now than they were back then. So I don't know if the pot is different, but what about the types of people? And here, if you're not already a sociologist and expert on changes in American society, it might not occur to you. But the authors of this study, they said, we think it's intellectual curiosity. They put it on a, what they would call, what I'm calling an antecedent variable. They said, well, the people who come to college, some people do smoke pot and some don't. And they think that intellectual curiosity helps explain who would smoke pot and who wasn't. I want to bring up intellectual curiosity because it ties in a lot with other things we're going to be talking about here. And by the way, the term was mentioned earlier in this class with tough guys. In the video Tough Guys, one of the features of that hypermasculinity was that intellectual curiosity was not part of it. What is intellectual curiosity? Well, it's interest in new ideas and new experiences. Now, the 1970s, a lot fewer people smoked pot than they do today. Nowadays, you could say there's a much higher number of people that smoke pot, and also that it's much more evenly distributed in the population. Man, I'm talking all about drugs, and these guys are like, no, too boring for me. Can you go back to talking about economic change and globalization? Because we were very interested then. No, I'm just kidding, but try not to interrupt my class, or you may get called out. Anyway, so where was I? So intellectual curiosity. In the 1970s, very few people smoked pot. Today, it's all races, all classes, all genders, both genders, or depending how many genders you say there are. And so, so it's a different behavior today than it was then. But back then, when we think of pot smoking, we think of hippies. What are hippies? Well, they were generally white people. They were generally upper middle class people. They were generally college-bound type of people. And what did pot smoking mean to the hippies? Well, it meant, enlightenment. The idea was you're going to experience food in a new way, music in a new way, your own thoughts in a new way. You're going to learn about yourself and about the world in ways you didn't know before. And so for a lot of the quote-unquote hippies, smoking pot was more than just let's get wasted and have fun. But they thought of it as actually getting in touch with the universe in a more meaningful way, a lot of them did, than people think of it now. And so why would you want to smoke pot? Why would you be interested? Well, if you were intellectually curious, if you were interested in new ideas and new experiences, then that might sound good to you. If you're the kind of person that's not interested in new ideas and new experiences, and a lot of Americans aren't, a lot of people have very set ways of thinking and say, well, I already know what I believe. I already know what's true. I don't need some new ideas because those aren't right. I don't need new experiences. The ones my parents had and I've had are fine. I don't need all that. And so some people are very kind of conservative and kind of closed in their thinking. Some people are more into new things, new experiences. In college, being closed-minded and rigid in your thinking isn't always very helpful. College professors tend to be intellectually curious people. We wouldn't spend 10 years in grad school eating top ramen every night if we didn't care about sociology. To get my PhD, I had to kind of sacrifice for a while. If it wasn't interesting, I wouldn't have done it. But what I'm saying is professors like intellectually curious people. If you're the kind of person that says, hey, I like new ideas. Wow, that was a really interesting idea you brought up about pot. I want to hear more about that. But the people who are like, is this on the test? I don't care what you're saying. I only care about my grade. And a lot of you are showing me right now that's all you care about. But if that's all you care about is your grade, then you're not like a college professor, because college professors aren't people like that usually. They are people who really care about ideas. They really enjoy learning, and it's fun for us. Now, high school is a little bit different. High school is a place where if you're the kind of person that's always raising your hand and saying, yeah, teacher, but what about this? Can you talk about this over here that you're not talking about? A lot of high school teachers would be like, well, no, we've got to get through this material, and you guys got to pass this test that I'm being graded on too, so we need to get through the material, not go off on a tangent. But in college, if you were to raise your hand and take me on a tangent, I'd love you. Because that shows me you actually are interested in sociology and you actually have questions going on in your mind. Your wheels are spinning going, wait, what about that? What about this? And a lot of students today, I don't see any wheels spinning. They're just like, tell me what I need for the test. And we're going to talk about this soon, because one of the topics we're going to learn about when we try to understand the research process is, what does research show us about education today? So I don't blame students for being a little intellectually dead or not worrying about new ideas. You're worried about getting through school, getting through so I can get my degree, so I can get on with my life. I understand. I get it. But college professors tend to be intellectually curious people. And so if you're trying to get good grades, being intellectually curious tends to help. The kind of people that come visit you in your office hours and want to talk about ideas, the people that email you and say, hey, what about this? The people who say, hey, I want to write can I write extra pages? Is 2 1 page? Can I write 4? Is that okay? I mean, the kind of people that want to go above and beyond because they're really fascinated, they generally do better. It's not like we just hand them out good grades, but they are going to get more help from a teacher. They're going to get more understanding from the teacher. So being intellectually curious is a good idea for college students, is what I'm trying to say. And back in the 1970s, it was reasonable for these researchers to make a theory that said, well, maybe this explains it. People who are interested in new ideas might be much more willing than other people to smoke pot at college. And if they're interested in new ideas, they're also probably the kind of people that get good grades in college classes. Maybe they didn't do so well in high school compared to others, but in college that's rewarded, that kind of way of being. And so it isn't that smoking pot caused you to get the good grades, it's that there was an antecedent variable that helped explain both behaviors and why they were linked, why people had both of them going on. And those people generally did better than those who didn't. So anyway, all I was trying to show there, though, I'm not trying to tell you should smoke pot. And I'm not trying to tell you should go visit your professors in their office hours. What was the point of doing this whole thing? The point was to illustrate what I'll call the first commandment of science, which is correlation is not causation. If we want to figure out if something's causing something, it's good to kind of draw a diagram like this and ask, did this thing really cause this? And a lot of times we'll find correlation. What does correlation mean?
Connects the two.
Huh?
Something that brings the two together.
Well, it means correlated. And these were correlated. In other words, when pot smoking went up, grades went up. When pot smoking went down, in other words, other people that didn't smoke pot, they generally had lower grades. So these two variables moved together. One went up, the other one went up. One went down, the other went down. They're correlated. But that doesn't mean this one is causing this one to go up and down. And if we can't prove that this one's causing this one to go up and down, we can't say that we have found causation. And so a lot of what science is trying to figure out, have I really found causation? Because human beings all the time think they found the cause for something. Every day you're like making decisions based on, I think this causes that, so I'm going to do this. Like the fact that you're in college. You probably have an idea in your mind that going to college, X, causes you to get higher income. That there's a correlation between going to college and getting a higher income. There is a correlation, a very strong one. It's somewhat causal, but just coming to college and sitting there and not doing anything probably won't lead to much higher incomes for you. So it's more than just having a college degree, but you have to actually learn the material. But anyway, the point being is you made a choice to come to college, and you made it based on a kind of theory that X causes Y. And you're probably making a good choice about that. But every day we do those kinds of things, and a lot of times we're not being very smart in assuming that one thing causes another. A lot of people are kind of superstitious. They'll do things like, oh, my team won the football game when I was wearing my little furry slippers with the Raiders on it. Raiders won. So now I'm going to wear my furry slippers every I don't know, what movie was that where the guy was like, that movie with Jennifer Lawrence? I don't know if you saw that.
Silver Linings Playbook.
Silver Lining Playbook. What was his superstition? I forget. But anyway, he always had to be watching the game or something like that. But anyway, we see connections between two things. This happened and then this happened, so that I know that the first thing caused the second. And it's just a natural human instinct, maybe, to see a pattern. And we love those patterns. It's how gambling addictions happen. People see, I pulled this arm and then I got rich on the slot machine. If I just keep doing that, it'll keep making me rich. And there's not a very good causal relationship between putting quarters in a slot machine and ending up with lots of money at the end. But we love to see those connections. So we think we found one, and we get all excited about it. But a scientist is somebody who says, well, I don't know, I see a connection, a correlation, but is it causal? And what really caused it? There are 3 criteria of causation. If I want to say that X causes Y, does X cause Y? There's 3 things that have to be true. First is, and you can ask yourself these things, did X happen before Y? Again, this is a logical thing, but to say that one thing caused another, logically you're saying the first one happened first and the second one happened second. Logically, it doesn't make sense to say that the chicken caused the egg if the chicken happened after the egg. But the whole chicken and egg thing is one of those conundrums where it's hard to figure out which was the first thing. But a lot of times in science, well, especially social science, I want to say, it's really hard to figure out which came first. With the GPA and pot smoking, even that one. Which came first? You could say maybe it's good GPA that leads to pot smoking, because if you were in high school before you got to college and you got really good grades there, then when you get to college you might say to yourself, I get good grades, it's not hard for me to get good grades, so if somebody offers me some pot, I'll say sure, why not, because getting good grades is easy for me. On the other hand, if you're somebody who struggled all through high school to get good grades, and then you're in college, you might say, well, I can't afford to go party and stuff like that, I won't get good grades, so maybe you don't. And so which came first? Well, in our little example, I was kind of stipulating that they all came in without smoking any pot or anything. We don't know their grades yet, so some smoked pot and some didn't. There's also the question of, well, maybe they smoked pot in high school before that too. I mean, just asking people, did you smoke pot in college? And I didn't look at the study itself for a while, but I don't remember, did they ask, when did you start smoking pot? Maybe if you already were able to smoke pot in high school and get good grades, that you didn't see a reason to stop doing that in college. Anyway, but sometimes it's hard to figure out which came first when it comes to like something like teen pregnancy and poverty. There's a strong correlation between poverty and teen pregnancy. In other words, girls who grow up in poor families are more likely to end up pregnant before they're married and before they're adults. Does that mean it's poverty that causes teen pregnancy? It's also the case that teen pregnancy causes poverty. I mean, a lot of those young girls, their moms were teen moms. And maybe some of their poverty had something to do with that. So which comes first, the chicken or the egg? And it's not always easy to separate that out. And in the data that you have, if you have a survey, for example, of a bunch of people saying, yes, I smoke pot, and that's all you don't have any data in there of when did you start, then it can be hard when trying to correlate that with other outcomes. Like, well, what's your income? Is there a connection between your pot smoking and your income? Well, it's hard to say when that happened first. Maybe they got rich and got a good job and started buying pot and then smoking. I mean, it's hard to figure out which came first. But if you can't prove that X came first and then Y happened, then you're not really in a position to say, I know for a fact that X caused Y. So you better be able to satisfy that first criterion. A second criterion is, does Y vary when and only when X varies? Now, I'm assuming you've heard the word variable before, and when I already used it when I'm talking about X and Y being the independent and dependent variables. But I remember when I was in college at your stage in life, the word variable always kind of confused me. Like, I want to know, well, what's a variable? In sociology, what can be a variable and what can't be? And don't let the word confuse you. A variable is anything that can vary. And almost anything can vary, so almost anything could be a sociological variable. But when we say they vary, well, let's take pot smoking. How can pot smoking vary? You could either not smoke pot or you could smoke pot. That would be a variation, and you could measure it that way as a dichotomous variable. Either you do or you don't. But you could also measure it in terms of how much you smoke pot. Are you somebody who smokes it once a month? Are you somebody who smokes it 5 times a day? Are you somebody who smokes it, once a lifetime? What are you? And so there's different ways of seeing how something varies, but that's all we're saying here is that things vary, and when we're trying to analyze things in sociology, we're trying to see whether the variation of this one is correlated with the variation of that one. So for example, as pot smoking goes from I don't do it to I do it, does that relate to any variation in grades from like 3.0 to 4.0 or 2.0 to 4.0? And so those are don't let the word variable, it just has to do with variation. And almost anything can vary in the sense it can either be present or not present in somebody's life or in somebody's behavior. That's a variation. Or it can vary in terms of a lot of things, like from 0 to infinity, like your age. You could be 0 years old, you could theoretically be infinity years old. Height varies from 0 infinitely up. So there are a lot of different ways for things to vary, but that's all we're talking about here. When we are asking about number 2, we're talking about what's called covariation. Do the two things vary together? And we saw that with our example. We asked, did they smoke pot first? Yes. They got to college, they smoked pot. And then did they get their grades? Yes, that happened after they smoked pot. So we kind of stipulated number 1. And then we stipulated, well, we said the study found this. We didn't just assume it was true, but the study told us that those who smoked pot, as pot smoking went up, grades went up. As pot smoking went down, grades went down. So these two things varied together. But as we said, we weren't ready with those two criteria satisfied. We didn't say, okay, we know pot smoking causes grades to go up. I'm going to go smoke a bunch of pot now, and my grades will just automatically rise. We felt like there needed to be something else we need to know here before we're ready to conclude that pot smoking is causing it. And that's the third criterion. It's called a test of spuriousness, or a test of I'm just going to call it non-spuriousness. That sounds kind of confusing, but to say that one thing causes another when it really doesn't, that's spurious reasoning or spurious thinking, or you're just wrong about it. And if you wrongly assumed that smoking pot caused you to get good grades based on these two things, that would be a spurious conclusion. You haven't found that yet. You can't show that yet because there's a third thing. Maybe it's spurious. We asked that. We said, is there something else that might be causing it? Is there a z variable here, antecedent? Is there a z variable, intervening? Is there a z variable over here maybe that's antecedent? And if you're a good scientist, when you find a correlation, like, a big one we're arguing about, and I shouldn't do this because I'm not a natural scientist, but a big one Americans like to argue about is global warming, the fact that our temperature is going up, our temperature is varying on the planet Earth and it's going up, is that correlated with human use of carbon and emission of carbon into the atmosphere? And is it a causal connection? Did release of carbon by humans cause global warming? And if you're a good scientist, just because you saw that carbon started being released a lot when cars came around in the 30s and 40s especially, and the 50s and 60s, and since then more and more carbon's been released, and since then more and more temperature has come to planet Earth. That's these two. But then there's the third one, which is, well, could there be some other explanation? Could it be something that happened between carbon and letting this? Or could there be a pre-existing thing like God or something that's causing the Earth to heat up? And so a lot of our debate in this country is over this question over, is this really causal or not? And so a lot of the discussion is between scientists. Most scientists that have looked at it have said, we've ruled out these other causes. We really think it's the carbon by humans causing the global warming. And these other possible variables have been ruled out. But if you can't rule them out, and we saw that with pot, could we rule out studying a lot as the reason they got grades? Could we rule out stress release? Could we rule out good nutrition? Well, we don't have any data to look at, but if we had the data to look at, we could start seeing, are those things correlated too? Because this one's correlated with that, but if these other ones in the data are also correlated with that, then we can't conclude that this one is the cause, because it could be any one of these. And if we look in the data for antecedent things that might have been true. One we didn't mention, a big one we could mention, this is often true with drug use. SES, socioeconomic status it's called. In a lot of sociology, where people are on the class ladder before they get somewhere explains a lot of their behavior once they get there. Like in school, if I try to figure out who gets good grades and who doesn't in here. A lot of it is socioeconomic status. People who came from wealthy homes with parents that have already been to college, that have been able to afford things like tutors and SAT classes, generally do better in college. People whose parents never went to college, people who don't have a lot of income, who can't afford tutors and things like that, generally don't do as well. So socioeconomic status, SES it's called, is very frequently a causal variable or correlating variable in sociology. But anyway, we were trying to rule out other possible causes. And we saw that there were many other possible causes, and if we can't rule them out, then we can't conclude that that X caused Y. So all of that is saying is, have other possible causes been ruled out? And so you have to look at the data, and you can start looking at things. Well, maybe it's just natural variations in the heat cycle. Maybe that's why our Earth. And so people start looking at that. Do the natural variations, are they strongly correlated with the amount of heating we have now? And the scientists say, well, no, that's not it.
So, when you're looking at this data, just researching anything, you can find two reports that say almost the exact opposite of each other. So it's like, well, you throw them both out, or?
No, you start analyzing them critically the way I'm doing here. And so one thing you would ask is, well, did they get their logic right? Did they look at all the possible causes or not? Did they jump too quickly and conclude too quickly that they found a correlation and assumed it was causal? Did they look at other possible variables? That would be one question to ask. There's other questions we can ask, but you're raising a very good question, which is, how do we decide in science, what studies are worthwhile and which aren't? Well, it's often debated, but that's part of what the research process is all about, is trying to produce research that other researchers will accept as being good research. And if you make mistakes in your research process, then that opens up the door for other researchers to say, your study's not good. We're not listening to your study. And so you yourself, if you find two studies that are saying two different things, you might not be enough of a scientist to decide which one's right and which one's wrong, but there is research literature out there that you can go consult and try to help you figure out what mistakes might have these different studies made and which can I decide is better. But you raise a good question, which I think helps me go to my next point, which is, well, when would I accept a study as being good and when would I reject one? Sometimes you can't really know whether to reject it or not if you haven't looked at data yourself. I mean, if the study is reporting data that they collected and analyzed and they're telling you this is what they found, well, you may have no basis to challenge it because you didn't go collect data and all you have is their data they're telling you is what it says. So it can be good to go look at another study that looks at other data, and if it says something totally different, then maybe your next thing would be, I need to go find other studies and see just between these two, that's not answering the question for me. But what do the preponderance of experts say? Or what's the consensus? Is there a consensus in the field? Meaning, do other scientists agree with this study or that one? And so, but the question you're asking is, well, partly what you're asking is, does research produce truth or not? Is there some studies that are just true and some studies that are not true? And maybe I'm asking too big of a question, but where I'd like to go next is with the issue of logical issues. We just were kind of looking at a logical issue, which is, how do I know if X causes Y? There's just some basic logic issues to settle. Like, did X come first? Are there other things in between X and Y or before X? Those are just logical things you can ask anytime you're trying to decide if something causes something. But there's other sets of logical issues that science needs to be worried about. One is tautology. Sometimes a study is illogical. And if the study is illogical, you can throw it out there and say, I'm not even going to look at their findings because the study is illogical in the way it was done. And if it's illogical, it can't be accurate. So there's no point in reading the rest of it. And sometimes studies make logical mistakes. And if they do, you can toss them out without reading the rest of it. Tautology is a fairly common logical mistake that happens in social science. It happens when, well, first of all, it's circular reasoning. Have you ever heard somebody say, well, you're just arguing in a circle. You're just talking in a circle. You're not saying anything. And that happens sometimes. And how does it happen? Well, it can happen in science when cause, meaning X, and effect, Y, are not clearly separated. When X and Y are not clearly separated, when X and Y are essentially the same thing, then you run into a circular logic problem. Let me give you an example. Well, we were talking about GPA. What causes GPA? Good GPA. And we said, well, it's not pot smoking. I don't think it's pot smoking that causes it. Maybe it's smart people. Maybe just being smart. In fact, somebody said that. You said that. Maybe they're just smarter. Well, how do I test that theory? What do I mean by smart? An idea here that will help us see why tautology happens. In order to use a variable like smart, or like intellectual curiosity, or SES, any variable has to be operationalized. Operationalization is the idea that in order to use a variable, I need to define it. What am I talking about? SES. What's SES? How much money do I need to be middle class or upper class? What do you mean SES, socioeconomic status. And we need a way to measure it. Well, you want to know somebody's status? How are you going to ask them? Are you going to ask them to tell you their income? Are you going to ask for their IRS report? You might not be able to get that if it's the president-elect. But anyway, if you're trying to figure out what, if you're trying to use a variable, you have to have a way to define it and measure it. And sometimes tautology happens when the way that you've defined and measured a variable bleeds into this other variable that you're trying to study. So what are some ways to define smart? I mean, is it a tautology to say smart people get good grades? Well, it might not be, but how can you operationalize smart? How can I measure if I'm trying to define who's smart in here and who's not smart? What can I use to decide that?
IQ test.
Maybe IQ test. Well, what if I use grades? What if I just ask, what's your GPA?
No, because some people test better than others.
Well, but if I just decide to use grades,
Then it wouldn't be.
well, it might not be valid, meaning you don't think it really measures what it says it measures because there's ways to get good grades without being smart. But I don't have access to your brain right now. I can't go look at it. So I need to use something to decide if you're smarter than the next guy. Maybe grades aren't a sign of your smartness, but maybe doing better than the other guy might mean you're smarter than him somehow. So couldn't I just use GPA? So in other words, people who get good grades are the people who get good grades. In other words, I didn't say anything. I just repeated myself. In other words, the thing I'm trying to explain, good grades, I just used it as the thing that explains it. Good grades are why you get good grades. Well, that's a tautology, and that's messed up, and that's not a good theory. And somebody could just say, you used the same thing you're trying to explain in your operationalization of the thing you were trying to use as the explanatory variable. So you have a tautology, boy. They're not a theory. A good theory is logically sound. And to be logically sound, your X has to be a distinct thing from your Y. And it'd be a good idea to use an IQ test. If you operationalize SMART as your score on the IQ test, then that would be a separate thing. Could I really see whether people above a certain score on the IQ test get better grades than other people below that score? And then I'd really be checking whether one thing is correlated with another. And if, again, it might be logically a problem to say that it causes you to get good grades, but it would be it wouldn't be tautological to see if these two things were correlated. But to see if grades were correlated with grades, well, that's circular. Of course they are. So let me give you an example, though, that's a real example from the world of sociology, and it happens more often than sociologists would probably like to admit. But there was a famous theory that came from the Chicago School. We kind of talked about the Chicago School the other week when we were talking about theories of crime. And we talked about strain theory, and we talked about how Robert Merton was studying the children of Polish peasants in Chicago. And he was part at that time of something called the Chicago School, which was a group of sociologists at the University of Chicago. And they had a theory called social disorganization theory. And really, this is maybe part of why Merton came up with his theory, was their theory was a little problematic. But what social disorganization theory said was social disorganization causes crime. And the question then is, well, what do they mean by social disorganization? How would you operationalize that variable? And they were trying to say, well, in the city of Chicago, as you go around the city of Chicago, there's different neighborhoods. And they're clearly distinct neighborhoods in terms of who lives there and how they are. And in their mind, you could clearly distinguish these neighborhoods in terms of how disorganized they were. That as you were walking through these neighborhoods, you as a sociologist would be able to measure certain things and see, well, this is a disorganized neighborhood, but this one over here, this is not a disorganized neighborhood. And then once you had a count of which ones were disorganized and which ones weren't, you could begin seeing which ones had high crime rate or not. And then you could test their theory and see, is it really true that having a disorganized neighborhood leads to crime? So they were asked, well, what do you mean? Define it. Social disorganization, measure it. And they said, well, what it means is a neighborhood that's not as organized as another, where it's kind of dysfunctional, disorganized. Well, what do you mean? What would we measure it with? Well, they said things like panhandling. If there's people begging on the street for money, that's a sign of a disorganized neighborhood. If there's prostitution, women on the corners soliciting, commercial relations with men. If there's children out on the street during school hours, running around during school hours, that's truancy. That's a sign of a disorganized neighborhood. So these are what we would call their indicators. They have this concept, social disorganization, and then they're using these things as indicators of the concept. So if you go through a neighborhood and you see these things, then you know you're looking at a disorganized neighborhood. If you don't see those things, then it's more of an organized neighborhood. Well, their critics looked at this theory and said, that's not a theory, boys and girls. That's a tautology. Why would it be circular reasoning or a tautology to operationalize this and say that these things are what accounts for why these neighborhoods have crime in them?
Because they are crime.
These are all crimes. Panhandling, prostitution, truancy, that's crime. So their operationalization of this variable, social disorganization, had crime in it. And so they contaminated their variable with the thing they're trying to explain. You're trying to explain crime. Why do some neighborhoods have prostitution and drug dealing and, truancy, and other neighborhoods have less of that? So if that's the thing you're trying to explain, it can't be part of the thing you're using to explain it, because then all you've really said is, well, neighborhoods with crime in them, those are the neighborhoods with crime in them. Wow, thanks, genius. You should run for president. You need a theory of crime. You need something else that isn't crime that's explaining why you have crime. And that would be more logically sound theory. And these theorists said, okay, it's not that our theory is bad, it's just we operationalized it wrong. You're right, these were things that shouldn't be in our definition. When we're comparing communities, we need something other than their crime to look at to decide whether they're disorganized or not. And so they began to look at physical characteristics of the neighborhood, like how dense is it? How many people per household on average? Is it a mixed-use zone? Is it just a place with houses? That would be single-use neighborhood. Or is it a mixed-use neighborhood with houses and businesses and industry? Is it dilapidated? In other words, is it a neighborhood where all the paint jobs are fine, the glass windows are all in good repair, the roads are in good repair? Or is it a falling apart neighborhood with broken windows and peeling paint and not well taken care of? So they said these now can be indicators of social disorganization. And then you can measure, are neighborhoods that have this kind of stuff also have more rape and prostitution and panhandling and other problems? And when they did it that way, then the theory makes more sense logically. And it also held up when you looked at those comparisons. There was a correlation between crime and these other things. That doesn't prove it's causal. They had to do more work than just that. But I'm trying to say that sometimes when you look at a theory, if you're saying X causes Y, ask yourself as the person looking at it, have they really made enough of a logical separation here between the thing they're trying to explain and the thing they're using to explain it? And sometimes people don't do that. For example, it often happens with theories of crime and why some neighborhoods have more of it than others. And sometimes people are using the very thing, like if you were to use, family breakdown or something, that's not a crime in and of itself, but maybe that's part of what you're trying to explain. Why is that a neighborhood with a lot of family breakdown in it? Not, so it's like you forgot there's some other cause really of the two things you're looking at. But anyway, tautology is one logical issue to be wary of and to be critical of as you're looking at people's studies. Here's one that I think is even more relevant, especially in today's world where we're having a hard time agreeing even on what counts as truth. I mean, we're in a weird state in America today where people don't agree even on what the facts are, much less which facts to use to decide, what causes what. Science is all about falsifiability. And it's a problem if your theory is unfalsifiable. This is a big word, but unfalsifiability or non-falsifiability. It's a long word because this is a long word, but you want your theory to be falsifiable. It sounds wrong because it sounds like a bad thing. But the fact of the matter is, in science, your theory must be falsifiable. Not that it is itself false. Obviously, if you're a theorist, a scientist, you want, and you have a theory of why something happens or what causes something, you hope your theory's right because you want people to go, wow, thank you, genius, you're great. We love you. Here's the Nobel Prize. There is no Nobel Prize for sociology, but maybe there should be. But anyway, you want your theory to hold up. You want people to like your theory, but you don't want your theory to be non-falsifiable. And that doesn't sound right, but it's true. What does that mean, though? What would be an example of a theory that's not falsifiable? What does it mean, falsifiable? Well, falsifiable means, so not the non, it means able, or I'll put it this way, capable of being proven false. I mean, it's possible, might not be likely, might not be, probable. But if it's impossible to prove your theory wrong, then it's not really a theory. Because there are certain statements that aren't open to logic and evidence. And if they're not open to logic and evidence, then there's no way to prove them wrong. And so they're not really theories, they're other kinds of things. They're not science theories. But can you think of any statement that you could give me that nobody anywhere, under any circumstance really, could prove was wrong? Prove was wrong?
Avoid the obvious one and go for the one that I know of. So the way that they've explained gravity recently is that there's invisible particles coming from a different plane of existence called gravitons that affect us. And they're immeasurable and unnoticeable. And I was like, well, all right.
It's great if you have a theory. There's this stuff out here you'll never be able to measure, but it's causing stuff. And no one can prove you wrong. It's nice. But yeah, that's yours. Maybe people aren't familiar enough with, but you're touching on the exact issues, which are, can I measure it? If I can't measure it, I can't prove it wrong. And if I can't measure it, then it's really nothing that belongs in science because science deals with logic and evidence. And if I can't measure something, I can't use it as evidence or not. And so science deals with measurable things. But are there things and so if somebody comes up with a theory of gravitons that are these things that you can't measure and can't see, and they're causing everything, well, you might as well call them little trolls. There's these little tiny trolls that fly throughout the universe, and they make everything happen. You'll never see one because they're invisible. It's a great theory. No one can prove you wrong, but that's why a scientist would say, that might make a cool movie, but that's not a scientific theory. Because we can't prove there aren't trolls. If they can't see them, how can we prove they're not there?
Aliens?
Italians?
Aliens.
Oh. What about aliens? To say that aliens don't exist, well, that would be a non-false, that is a falsifiable theory. Because if one day aliens show up, your theory just got proved wrong, dude. So that to say, I believe there are aliens out there, or aliens are causing, black holes or whatever, maybe that's capable of being proven wrong because one day if there were, well, you're getting me confused here. But let's give one that's a very common one, which is to say God created the universe. Has science proven that wrong? No. God may very well have created the universe. If you're somebody who has faith and believes in God and you know God created the universe, no scientist on planet Earth has ever proven you wrong. Why? Why not?
Because it's not measured.
Because you can't measure God. God is this unseen, invisible thing that's everywhere at all times. So no scientist can do a study that will show you it wasn't God that created the universe. There's no way to test that theory. There's no universe that wasn't created by God that I can go to and compare it to ours and see if they're different. or there's no Godometer. Like if I had a little machine that could see how much God there was in the room right now, I could maybe measure and see if this universe has more of it than some other place. But the very term refers to something that's not measurable. So if it's not measurable, I can't prove it didn't cause the universe. Maybe it did. So scientists have not proven religion wrong. And what I want to make clear here to you is religion's a different way of knowing. It doesn't deal with logic and evidence. It deals with faith. And maybe some logic here and there, but it's dealing with things people believe without being proven true or wrong. They're just faith things. I just know there's God, and that's what created the universe. And even if you confront somebody with a theory, well, we say it's the Big Bang. Is the Big Bang measurable? Yeah, I mean, it's based on ideas of how much matter's in the universe, how much, the speed at which matter's traveling, and things like that. And if you say, well, it's the Big Bang, that caused the universe, well, a person of faith will say, I don't care. Well, what caused the Big Bang then? God. So they'll always come back to this thing you can't have seen and can't have measured, and that's the cause of everything. So a scientist at some point has to say, I can't prove you wrong. So if you want to believe that, go believe it. And many scientists believe it themselves because it's not something that can be proven wrong. So that's not a theory, that's a statement of faith. So statements of faith that are dealing with unmeasurable things are unfalsifiable. And therefore, a scientist can't prove them wrong, and therefore we're not really talking about the same thing. And so it's a good thing we have churches. Those are places you can go and talk to priests about unmeasurable things, things that we know are there through faith rather than through logic and evidence. But a university and a college like this one, especially